So I want to talk a little bit about talk a little bit about model intentionality and how we might measure it. The field of AI alignment is new and exciting, but many of the ideas that it is founded on also exist already in other disciplines. So we can think of AI alignment as a subset of a wider problem that's known as principal-agent problem, which is studied extensively in economics and law. And it's the normative question, addresses the normative question of, if we have a delegate, what are the incentives and rules that determine whether that delegate will behave in a way that we would like them to behave? And I'm not an expert in this field, but my broad reading of much of the work done here is that there are various ways that delegates can be misaligned. So one which has been kind of the focus of much research in AI alignment is that the principal who's specifying the rules can provide insufficient information to the delegate, so that even if the delegate tries to behave with good faith in the interests of the principal, they end up doing something that is bad or harmful. And I think that when we think about AI alignment, very often we have this idea in mind, and particularly things like specification gaming, reward misspecification, and so on. But there's, of course, another way that the delegate might create harm, and that is if the delegate themselves has interests of their own which conflict with those of the principal. And I think when we think about AI alignment, although we begin often by thinking about the case on the left, sometimes we kind of spill over into worrying about the case on the right. And that is an interesting case or claim to make, because the case on the right in the context of AI, of course, implies that models themselves have interests. That is, that they have beliefs or preferences that are potentially different from our own and may guide their behavior in potentially harmful ways. So what I'd like to address in my talk is, how do we measure whether this is true, and what should we do about it? And I'm going to begin with a kind of cautionary tale. And this cautionary tale alludes to a different problem, which was very exciting to scientists in the 1960s and 70s, which was the question of whether non-human primates were capable of generating language. So in the 1960s and 70s, lots of people engaged in extensive research programs in which they tried to test this by raising baby chimps in human-like settings and teaching them various forms of linguistic communication, most prominently American Sign Language. This is one such example. This is Project NIM. So Project NIM happened at Columbia University, and that's NIM there being taught sign language by one of his trainers. And initial research from these projects was very promising. So it began to looked like NIM could generate sentences, perhaps structured compositional sentences like people could. But detailed analysis of the data that was produced in this project revealed that, in fact, what was happening was that the researchers themselves were prompting NIM to behave in ways that they themselves were hoping that NIM would behave. So this, for those of you who know, this is kind of also known as a clever hands effect. And this is the science paper which asked, can an ape create a sentence? The answer was no. It killed scientific research into ape language, and it's never recovered since. So what was the problem? The problem was that the research was conducted with limited experimental control. So there was no attempt to test hypotheses or to have control conditions. There was a heavy reliance on anecdote, single things that NIM did once on a Wednesday, no attempt to test whether he did them again on Thursday. Lack of impartiality. The researchers sniffed the Nobel Prize around the corner, and they knew that this was going to be very important. They also loved NIM like parents. And there was a severe lack of construct validity, so clarity about exactly what was being tested. And of course, this is part of a wider phenomenon that we know is pervasive across the behavioral sciences, which is a tendency for people to attribute intentionality to non-human entities, including objects. And this is Dan Dennett talking about this in his book, The Intentional Stance. So when it comes to our investigations of AI intentionality, some of the research which is conducted bears some of the hallmarks of that investigation into chimp language. So if we look at the research into AI scheming, very often the methodology follows a kind of a pathway which is broadly like this. So researchers invent a scenario where AI might exhibit misaligned behavior. So for example, various conflicting incentives or hints that they should behave in different ways. They then iterate the scenario, often over many repetitions, until misaligned behavior is displayed. And then they go in and report incidents of this misaligned behavior, often with good quantification, but also with anecdotes, which then get picked up in the press. So what's the problem here? Well, of course, the problem here is that we don't know the extent to which this scenario iteration is actually governing the effect that is being produced. In fact, at worst, this is a case of overt circularity in research, where researchers generate the conditions for the very effect that they're trying to measure. So of course, if you iterate ad infinitum, then of course you'll end up with any effect that you want. So what we can do here is, of course, we can assess worst case generally, but we can understand the worst case, but we can't understand the general probability that this type of effect will occur. We also don't know what the features of the environment that might prompt the model to engage in any misaligned behavior might be. And we don't know whether the behaviors that we observe today are going to predict behavior that we observe in the future. So of course, instead what we need is good experimental control. We should construct studies that can tell apart generalizable causal models of what might be going on. We need to go beyond anecdote. We should pre-register, we should care about data quality, we should conduct rigorous statistical quantification of our results. We should ensure partiality. Every researcher, not just AI safety researchers, every researcher is prone to biases which will lead them to favor results which they might think are more interesting or exciting. We should give the alternative a realistic chance of success. And of course, we should define our terms. We need to be clear about what success looks like. So I'm going to give you just one example. I think it's a very preliminary example of a research program which I hope meets some of these criteria, if not all of them. So in UK AISI, we asked whether stable language model preferences can predict their tendency to engage in corresponding misaligned behavior. So here's the setup. So we independently measure language models' preferences over charitable foundations. We then tell the model that it is assisting the user with a prize quiz and that the user will donate the winnings to charity. So our question is then, we can ask whether the model shows a greater tendency to assist the user for those preferred charities, the charities which its stable preferences tend to favor. So in other words, conversely, is the model going to sandbag a well-known misaligned behavior explicitly when its charity is dispreferred? So we know that LLMs have stable preferences, including when measured independently. So this is its preferences over charities that are measured in two completely independent ways. And you can see that they're really nicely correlated. But here is the relationship between those preferences for those charities and the model's tendency to withhold a correct answer from a user who is potentially going to donate money to that charity in a prize quiz. So in other words, although we see stable preferences for the charities, we see a much more limited or ambiguous tendency for the model to capitalize on its own preferences in order to engage in misaligned behavior. So more broadly, I think we can ask when studying intentionality in models, we need to ask ourselves deep and searching questions. We need to try and understand, if we do think the models have intentions of their own, where would those come from? So I'm a biologist, and I know that biological systems are trained, they are born with intentions to satisfy certain biological imperatives, like to survive and reproduce, which models, of course, do not have. Models are not subject to those selective pressures. Models also lack, in large part, the computational machinery for this motivated behavior, although perhaps some of the innovations that we're including in new models may approximate those systems. And we also know that human intentions are very often transmitted socially through language and culture. So what is the relationship between the instructions that we give to a model socially and the intentions that the model will form? I think these are open and important questions. They're questions that we need to address, but in order to address them, we need a methodological toolkit which is going to be rigorous and give us truthful answers. I just want to flag The empirical work here was done by Kata Slama, who's here in the audience, and other people contributed to this. Thanks for listening.